Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Colorado. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The incident was first entered into county records on the morning of October 18th, 1991, 3 days after the school bus from the small town of Harrow Ridge failed to complete its routine drive back from a regional field trip. Officially, it was listed as a delayed return due to suspected mechanical failure. Unofficially, the town's volunteer marshal, Clyde Alder, wrote something different in his private log. Driver's route impossible. Road ends long before where tracks say it continue. Harrow Ridge itself was a town that sat at the edge of several forested runs that led toward the higher terrain near Storm King Mountain, a name that appears in a number of later notes and testimonies surrounding this case. While the mountain would become more widely known a few years later for an unrelated wildfire tragedy, locals in 1991 already regarded it with an old, quiet caution, never spoken aloud, but felt. The bus in question was a yellow 1979 Blue Bird model with the number 6 stenciled above the grille. It carried 9 students between ages 10 and 12, along with their driver, a former mechanic named Dennis Rourke. Rourke had driven the route dozens of times without incident. Teachers described him as patient, even-tempered, and meticulous about maintenance. Parents remembered him as the quiet man who always returned the kids exactly on time, never early, never late. On the morning of October 15th, the bus left Harrow Ridge Elementary at 7:42 a.m. for a geology field trip. The intended destination was a well-documented roadside outcrop used in local science programs, only 50 minutes away, well within the district boundary. Weather reports from that day note a cold, dry wind but clear skies. Nothing suggested trouble, and yet at 4:10 p.m. when the bus failed to arrive back at the school, the principal placed the customary call to the marshal's office. By 4:40, parents were gathering in clusters outside the small brick building, preparing themselves for a minor breakdown or detour. No one at that moment imagined anything larger than inconvenience. The first search effort was modest: 2 trucks, a patrol car, and a handful of volunteers. Tracks from the bus were found along County Road 12, the expected path, but they continued far past the turnoff where Rourke should have exited. According to the earliest witness notes, the tire impressions remained steady, unhurried, and without any sign of swerving. They simply carried forward into a narrowing corridor of trees, a stretch not used by school vehicles, and, according to the forestry map, effectively a dead end. Alder's initial report mentions that the tracks continued confidently, as if following a mapped route that does not exist. That line would become the quiet nucleus of the mystery. When darkness fell, the search was called off for safety. But several volunteers later noted something that would only be included in their private statements: that the forest felt unusually still that evening, as if waiting. By sunrise of October 16th, a larger, county-wide search group assembled. These were not federal authorities, just neighboring towns responding to what they assumed was a navigational error. The assumption seemed reasonable. The Blue Bird buses of that decade were prone to fuel line issues in cold air, and Rourke, despite his diligence, had mentioned trouble starting the engine the previous week. But once the teams retraced the path beyond the expected turnoff, those explanations quickly thinned. The bus's tire tracks continued another 3 miles into terrain that had not been maintained since the 1970s. Several men remembered old signage for a logging route that once approached the foothills near Storm King Mountain, but forestry records confirmed that the road had been officially closed and partially dismantled 18 years earlier. That the bus had managed to follow its remnants so far puzzled the investigators. Along this forgotten passage, the ground shifted from compacted dirt to fractured stone. Tire marks became harder to read, but they were still present in patches, spaced evenly. No signs of the sudden braking or frantic corrections that might suggest panic or mechanical failure. The route narrowed until the searchers were walking single file, ducking beneath branches heavy with dust and old needles. Jesse Morrill, a volunteer whose handwritten notes survive in the case file, wrote, "If the driver kept going here, he must have believed he was on a legitimate road. No ordinary man could mistake this for one." By midday, the search group reached a natural choke point where a rockfall from years earlier had sealed the way. It was impossible for any vehicle to pass. Yet on the near side of the debris, they found the final readable impressions of the bus's tires, headed straight toward the obstruction. On the far side, the dirt was undisturbed. Marshal Alder ordered the area probed from multiple angles, suspecting the bus had reversed and taken an alternate path. But no such path existed. The forest narrowed into steep, unforgiving slope. A machine as large as a school bus could not simply turn around without leaving deep marks, and none were found. Parents were informed that afternoon, though the marshal's office withheld details, describing the situation as an extended search in developing terrain. Several letters from mothers preserved in the town archives reveal the tension of that evening. Women sitting together in living rooms, speaking softly, trying not to imagine their children cold or hungry somewhere in the mountains. Meanwhile, an early theory proposed that the bus had been stolen, with the tracks fabricated somehow. That idea collapsed once investigators noticed small details. The patterns left by the bus's weight matched perfectly with the known wear of number 6's suspension. Even more concerning was the discovery of faint shoe prints, children's sizes, appearing intermittently along the path, as though some of the students had stepped out briefly and then been ushered back inside. By nightfall, the first contradictions began appearing in the official statements. One search team insisted they heard a distant engine earlier that day. Another swore the forest had felt unnaturally quiet. None of it matched, and none of it helped them find the bus. The mountain wind picked up after sundown, carrying with it a metallic scent that several volunteers later compared to old machinery left in the rain. The morning of October 17th brought the first official escalation. The county approved aerial support, an aging helicopter borrowed from a neighboring jurisdiction. Its pilot, a former Air Force mechanic named Harold Lanning, flew grid patterns over the forest for nearly 4 hours. His report, filed the same afternoon, stated plainly, "No yellow vehicle, no reflective surface, no artificial structure visible within the search radius." He added a single troubling line at the bottom, one investigators would debate for weeks. "Observed disturbance in tree canopy along abandoned logging grade. Pattern consistent with large vehicular passage. No endpoint identified." Despite repeated flights, the bus was never spotted from above. Back on the ground, search teams expanded their sweep. The slope rising toward the Storm King region became a focus, partly due to local folklore and partly due to sheer process of elimination. Older residents had long spoken of strange echoes in that direction, voices mistaken for wind, lights flickering in places where there were no trails. Those stories were considered harmless superstition, but after 2 days without tangible evidence, even the most pragmatic volunteers began to reference them quietly. Marshal Alder reluctantly documented one such account from a retired ranger, Calvin Hurst, who warned, "Paths up here don't stay the way you remember them. They shift after storms. I've seen gullies open where none were the week before." Though recorded, the statement was marked as irrelevant. Meanwhile, more traces began to surface. On a cluster of stones about a mile beyond the rockfall, searchers located a fragment of chipped yellow paint. A chemical test later confirmed it matched the bus's exterior, though the amount suggested it had been scraped with significant force. That raised a new question. If the bus had made contact with something substantial enough to shear off paint, why were there no corresponding metal fragments or deep gouges in the nearby rock? Worse still was the discovery of a student's plastic lunchbox lying beneath a net of fallen branches. The item belonged to 11-year-old Hannah Cluridge. Her mother identified it by a set of tiny sticker initials she had placed inside the lid. The lunchbox was found upright, intact, and without any sign of animal interference. Its contents, half a sandwich, an apple, and a folded note from home, were untouched. Inconsistent details accumulated quickly. The lunchbox was discovered far beyond the final tire tracks, implying it had been carried or thrown there. And yet no child-sized footprints were present in the surrounding soil, which remained smooth and undisturbed, as though no one had walked through it for weeks. When investigators returned the next morning to re-examine the area, the lunchbox was gone. Its imprint on the ground remained, but the object itself had vanished. The disappearance was attributed to misplacement by volunteer personnel, though no one admitted to moving it and no record exists of it being logged into evidence. By the 18th, the Harrow Ridge community began to fracture. Some residents pleaded for federal involvement. Others whispered that the search had gone on long enough, that whatever the mountains had taken was not meant to be found. It was a sentiment older inhabitants understood instinctively, though none would state it plainly. On October 19th, 4 days after the bus's disappearance, Marshall Alder agreed to bring in Dr. Reuben Aldrich, a geology professor from a nearby college. Aldrich was one of the few regional academics who had conducted fieldwork near Storm King Mountain both before and after parts of the old logging system were abandoned. His inclusion in the search appears to have been prompted by Lanning's earlier aerial note, the one describing disturbances in the canopy. In the archived interview transcripts, Aldrich spoke carefully, almost academically, but there was a tension beneath his words. He explained that the slopes around Storm King were composed of layered volcanic and sedimentary formations that were prone to sudden shifts. Not dramatic landslides, but quieter movements, slabs tilting, narrow gullies appearing, old man-made grades subtly sinking each season. He suggested that if the bus had continued forward, it might have crossed unstable ground that left little trace after settling. This explanation eased the nerves of some searchers, but not all. Morrell's journal, found years later, captured the sentiment others felt. Professor speaks sensibly, but it doesn't answer how the bus drove past the rockfall or why the children's voices seemed so near when no one was found. That line, though unverified, reflects a rumor circulating among volunteers that on the night of the 17th, a pair of searchers believed they heard distant laughter echoing from the ridge. The claim was never entered in the official record. Aldrich walked the abandoned grade personally, pausing at the painted stone fragment site. He remarked that the abrasion looked too clean to be caused by natural rock, suggesting instead a metal surface or sharp object the bus may have brushed against. Yet no such object was found. When asked if the scrapings could have come from old logging equipment buried beneath debris, he responded, "Possible, but unlikely unless something was unearthed recently." One of the more baffling discoveries occurred later that afternoon. A shallow depression in the soil, roughly rectangular, was found about 100 yards upslope from the last known sign of the bus. The depression contained 2 items, a bent metal rod and a torn strip of black vinyl believed to be from a seat covering. However, soil analysis later indicated the depression was older than a week, contradicting its neat edges and the freshness of the artifacts. A note in the evidence log reads, "Ground appears disturbed recently, yet surrounding layers suggest earlier settling. Inconsistent stratification." Yes. Locals who had lived near the forest for decades offered their own recollections. One elderly resident, Miriam Cole, told investigators that in the late 1960s she'd seen vehicles wandering where no roads remained, though she later said she couldn't be certain of the year. She added, "The mountain keeps its own paths. Folks forget that." While her statement was dismissed as folklore, it reappeared in later academic papers discussing the case, often cited as an example of regional superstition. As dusk approached, the search expanded toward a narrow ravine that Aldrich believed might have once connected to the old logging road, though there were no surviving maps to confirm it. What little daylight remained cast a pale glow over exposed stone and twisted roots, giving the impression of an animal's open jaw. Several team members reported an unsettling sensation near the ravine's entrance, an inexplicable pressure in the air, as though the forest were leaning inward. Nothing was found within those shadows, but the feeling lingered among them long after they stepped back into the fading light. The ravine search formally began at first light on October 20th. The terrain was tight and angular, forcing searchers to descend in single file while anchoring ropes around stunted pines. The air temperature dropped sharply inside the chasm, enough that several volunteers noted mist forming with each breath, despite temperatures outside remaining above freezing. Marshall Alder later wrote that this was the point at which he grew certain the bus had not simply driven off somewhere, but had entered an area untouched for decades, an area possibly concealed by shifting land, old erosion, or something not fully understood. Aldrich, the geology professor, maintained his composure, though transcripts indicate he paused often to examine the stone faces. He commented that some of the fractures appeared newer than their surrounding environment, as if stressed by recent weight, though he did not commit to a definitive explanation. About 50 yards down, the team found a scrap of reflective glass wedged between two rocks. It was curved, faintly tinted, consistent with the side mirror of a 1970s Blue Bird model. The edges were sharp, unweathered, and free of moss or soil staining. It suggested recent breakage. Yet no other fragments were located nearby, and there was no sign of how such a mirror would have reached that depth without leaving a trail of impact. Further into the ravine, the group split into two units. The eastern team encountered a shelf of flattened pine needles that looked, in Morrell's words, as though something large had rested there. The impression measured roughly 9 feet in length, the approximate size of the bus from wheel well to wheel well. But the outline was vague, too smooth to be considered reliable evidence. A wildlife expert later attributed it to winter bedding from elk, though the angle and shape were irregular for that behavior. The western team made the more disturbing find, a child's mitten caught on a protruding root. It was damp but not decayed, indicating it had been exposed to the elements for only a day or two. The mitten belonged to 12-year-old Carter Lind, confirmed by his mother's sewing pattern inside the cuff. Here again, the soil around the area told a contradictory story. No footprints, neither adult nor child, were visible. The ground showed no compression, no slide marks, no indication that anyone had climbed or stumbled through. Records indicate that morale among the volunteers began to fracture at this point. Several opted to leave the search entirely, citing exhaustion, cold, or family obligations. Privately, Alder recorded that 2 men refused to stay after sunset, stating that the ravine echoed strangely when spoken into. One even claimed that certain words bounced back in a different tone, though no formal test was conducted to verify it. As the searchers emerged from the ravine late that afternoon, a soft haze drifted through the trees above, an occasional weather phenomenon in the region, but unnerving in its timing. Aldrich compared the effect to low cloud shearing common near Storm King Mountain, where sudden temperature changes created optical distortions. He cited this again as an example of how the mountain's environment could mislead the senses, just as old forestry workers once described the area's shifting lines and deceptive depth. Still, no one could explain how a bus, its driver, and 9 children had entered a ravine without leaving a visible trail of entry. The question hung over the search teams like the cold air itself, heavy, waiting, unresolved. By October 21st, frustration had displaced optimism. A week had passed since the disappearance, and although evidence surfaced in fragments, paint, a mirror shard, a mitten, none of it formed a coherent path. Investigators requested access to the school district's maintenance logs for bus number 6, hoping mechanical records might hint at vulnerabilities, steering issues, faulty brakes, any defect that might have forced work off course. The logs revealed nothing unusual. Rourke had replaced the alternator the previous spring, inspected the brakes in August, and submitted a voluntary note in early October describing a soft rattle at low speed, which he resolved by tightening the mountings on the rear compartment. Teachers vouched for his diligence. One wrote, "If anything, Dennis overprepared." The absence of mechanical explanation only deepened the mystery. On the afternoon of the 21st, searchers discovered something unusual on a slope west of the ravine. Embedded in the dirt was a narrow rut, straight, shallow, and about the width of a bus tire, though only one track existed rather than the expected pair. It stretched for nearly 40 feet before fading into loose rock. Photographs show the imprint to be clean, uniform, with defined edges. Yet the soil was far too soft to have supported the full weight of the vehicle. The rut, therefore, made no sense. Aldrich proposed it might be a collapsed burrow or vent, its shape coincidental. Others doubted it. Morrell's journal records his reaction simply, "Not natural, not a trail, something else." Another curious detail emerged around the same time. 2 searchers reported hearing a metallic clatter somewhere upslope, like a chain striking stone. They radioed Alder, who logged the sound, but no follow-up noise occurred and no physical source was found. Throughout the case notes, similar auditory anomalies appear repeatedly. Distant engines, muted thumps, impressions of voices. None were consistent enough to be considered reliable. That evening, a formal briefing gathered all remaining volunteers. Alder addressed the group with a straight-backed calm that belied his exhaustion. He emphasized the importance of methodical procedure and informed them that the county was considering shifting to a limited search protocol, a phrase that drew quiet despair from several parents. Federal assistance had not yet been approved. The case lacked indicators of criminal interference, and the terrain complications made rapid deployment impractical. But before the meeting adjourned, Aldrich requested one final sweep of a plateau above the ravine, a flat rise partially hidden by thick brush. Aerial photos taken days earlier showed nothing there, but a note in his field book suggested the ground might contain subtle disruptions. Alder approved the search, citing the professor's expertise. The ascent was steep. Searchers used ropes to climb the final incline, dislodging sprays of dirt and pine needles. At the top, they found the expected brush, a scattering of stones, and a crooked stand of saplings. But they also found something that froze them in place. A series of impressions, faint, uneven, but unmistakably circular, dotted the plateau. They were spaced precisely like the wheels of a large vehicle. Not deep enough for a bus's full weight, but too consistent to be random. A few prints overlapped, as though the vehicle had paused and adjusted its angle. Nearby, in a concave patch of earth, lay 3 parallel scratches, each about the length of an adult's forearm. When measured, The spacing between the wheel-like imprints matched almost perfectly with the axle width of the missing school bus. There was one problem. Reaching this plateau by vehicle was physically impossible. There were no roads, no navigable slopes, no ramps, and no evidence of a machine powerful enough to lift a 10-ton bus onto that height. The searchers stood in silence as wind swept across the rise. More than one later remarked that the air felt strangely hollow, as if sound entered but did not fully return, a sensation not uncommon near the cliffs bordering Storm King Mountain, though deeply unsettling in this context. The plateau findings shifted the entire investigation into a different register, quieter, more deliberate, heavy with the awareness that they were no longer looking for a simple accident site. Marshal Alder ordered a detailed survey of the area, marking each circular impression with stakes and measuring distances twice over. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, though many later developed with a faint distortion along the edges, attributed to humidity exposure during storage. Aldrich, the geology professor, examined the ground with almost clinical calm. He observed that the soil atop the plateau was thin, fragile, and had not been significantly disturbed in decades. The impressions, therefore, were recent, days old at most. He also pointed out that a vehicle capable of leaving such marks would have had to traverse a slope far steeper than standard machinery could manage. His measured conclusion entered into the notes: no known path of ascent, impressions consistent with vehicular spacing but inconsistent with known physical access. This observation reignited an older rumor circulating quietly among the volunteers, that some searchers had seen light flickering through the trees the previous night. The story was never confirmed, but Morrell's recovered journal includes a telling phrase: saw a glow beyond the pines, like headlights turning where no road lies. The entry is undated, leaving speculation its only anchor. Later that afternoon, a fragment of corrugated rubber, likely from a bus's entry step, was found wedged in a narrow crack between two stones along the plateau's edge. It bore scrape marks that suggested significant force, but again, no corresponding gouges, scuffs, or structural debris were found on the surrounding rock. The piece appeared almost placed, though no one suggested that in official reports. As investigators continued their sweep, they discovered an object that complicated matters further: a torn page from a composition notebook. The edges were ripped unevenly, as if pulled from its binding in haste. The page contained short handwriting consistent with a child's script. Only two clear phrases could be read. "We're not on the right road." Mr. R said, "Stay quiet." The page was analyzed for environmental exposure and determined to be less than 48 hours old. But no other pages were found, and none of the missing children's school notebooks matched its pattern exactly. Administrators later confirmed that classroom inventories did not include this specific brand. Marshal Alder included the notebook page in evidence but refrained from sharing it with the families immediately, hoping to avoid unnecessary distress. Nonetheless, word leaked. By that evening, a quiet panic spread through Harrow Ridge. Conversations behind closed doors, phones ringing late into the night, kitchen lights left burning until dawn. One additional complication emerged that same night. A pair of volunteers returning from the search area reported seeing strange indentations along a ridge just northeast of the plateau, elongated, irregular depressions spaced unevenly. They described them as drag marks, though later examination suggested they might have been the remnants of a minor rock slide. But one detail persisted in all versions of their account. The depressions led toward a dense stand of cedar trees and then stopped abruptly, without continuation. Alder's log entry from that night is terse but revealing. Patterns do not align with natural processes. We'll reassess tomorrow. In the closing line of his personal notes, he added something he never submitted into the official file. The mountain is rearranging itself, or we are losing our bearings. Yes. The mention of shifting terrain echoed the warnings older forestry workers had once given about the region near Storm King Mountain, warnings that, until that moment, Alder had dismissed as superstition. October 22nd began with a muted, almost resigned calm. The search had grown into something more meticulous than expansive, no longer widening outward, but spiraling around contradictions. Alder and Aldrich agreed to focus on the cedar stand where the so-called drag marks terminated. The area was thick, its branches woven tightly enough to obscure daylight, and any approach required cutting tools. Inside the grove, the temperature seemed to dip several degrees. Moisture clung to the bark and gathered in shallow pockets along the forest floor. What immediately caught the team's attention were several small depressions, rounded, shallow, and scattered irregularly as though something had pushed down into the soil and then lifted cleanly away. None were deep enough to match the weight of a bus, yet they held the same faint patterning observed on the plateau, slight compressions with crisp edges. One volunteer, a surveyor named Patricia Hale, noted that the depressions aligned loosely with one another, forming a gentle arc. She sketched the arrangement in her field notebook, adding that the pattern felt deliberate. No one openly endorsed that conclusion, but no one dismissed it either. Farther inside the cedar stand, the team found something more tangible, a small length of reflective tape, commonly used on school bus bumpers in the 1970s and 80s. The adhesive side was clean, unstained by soil, suggesting it had not lain there long. Yet again, there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no broken branches, nothing to indicate how it arrived in that precise spot. The investigation then widened outward from the grove, tracing a perimeter. On the southern edge, a series of thin scratches marred the trunk of a cedar, parallel lines, each about 5 inches long, too shallow and even to be made by animals. The direction of the scratches suggested contact with a flat, rigid surface, possibly metal. But the height was puzzling, roughly 4 feet from the ground, far lower than the body of a bus would typically scrape. Aldrich examined the marks closely. His field notes later paraphrased in the county file read, possibly caused by contact with displaced object, orientation inconsistent with known vehicular profiles. Even in his careful academic phrasing, the uncertainty was clear. Around midday, a shift in the weather unsettled the group further. A thin fog rolled into the upper slopes, moving in from the direction of Storm King Mountain. Fog was not unusual for the region, but this one descended with startling speed, muting sound and dulling the outlines of trees. Several volunteers described feeling as though the landscape had folded inward, shrinking the world to a radius of only a few yards. It was in this dimmed atmosphere that the searchers heard something, a rhythmic tapping, faint but distinct, echoing from just beyond the cedar stand. Hale later described it as a mechanical knock, like a loose panel blowing in wind, though there was no wind at the time. The sound persisted for nearly 30 seconds before fading abruptly. Investigation of the surrounding area yielded nothing, no metal, no fallen tools, no source. When the fog thinned a short while later, one more peculiarity came into view. On the northern side of the grove, the brush parted into a narrow corridor, one that none of the searchers recalled seeing earlier. The ground within was smooth, undisturbed, and curved gently downslope, leading back toward a section of forest already searched days before. Alder ordered the corridor photographed and marked. He did not allow anyone to follow it until the area could be assessed in full daylight. In his personal notes that evening, Alder wrote, "Paths appearing where none existed, soil showing direction without cause. The professor says the mountain plays tricks of scale near certain fault lines." but this feels like something older than maps. The phrase older than maps would reappear years later, when academics revisited the case while discussing regional anomalies near Storm King Mountain, always as a metaphor, never with explanation. The new corridor discovered on October 22nd became the central focus on the following morning. The fog had lifted entirely, leaving the forest unnervingly clear, as though it wanted to be observed. The narrow path curved downward in a subtle arc, hemmed in by brush that appeared untouched. No broken twigs, no scuffed bark. The ground itself bore a fine layer of fallen needles, evenly distributed, with a shallow sheen in certain places that suggested recent compression despite the lack of visible footprints. Searchers stepped carefully, documenting every meter. According to Hale's sketches, the corridor maintained a nearly constant width, just wide enough for a single person to walk, not wide enough for a bus. Still, the curvature echoed the spacing of the impressions found on the plateau the previous day. An atmospheric coincidence, perhaps, but several volunteers noted the similarity. Roughly 40 yards down the slope, the corridor widened slightly into a small clearing. There, beneath a mat of leaves, the team found an object collapsed inward on itself, a child's backpack. It had been folded oddly, almost compacted, with its straps tucked beneath the fabric. The zipper was partially open, revealing a pencil case and a small stack of index cards used for studying spelling words. The name Jennifer L. was written faintly on the inside tag, belonging to 10-year-old Jennifer Love. But the disturbing detail was the condition of the cards inside. Each had become lightly curled at the edges as though exposed to moisture or heat, yet the interior of the pack was dry. Tests later suggested brief exposure to high humidity, though the clearing itself held no signs of dampness. The cards also bore faint indentations, as if someone had pressed a dull point repeatedly against them, not writing, not carving, but testing the pressure. After the discovery, the clearing grew unnervingly silent. Multiple journals mention a dead quiet settling among the trees, a quiet so complete that even distant bird calls seemed to have withdrawn. Hale claimed she felt a faint vibration beneath her feet, too slight to be tectonic, too soft to be machinery. Others felt nothing. Alder instructed the team to continue past the clearing. The corridor narrowed again, bending sharply to the right before stopping at a sheer drop, a compact cliff face perhaps 10 feet high. It was not impassable for a person, but impossible for a bus. Yet embedded in a crack midway up the stone was a streak of yellow paint, identical in hue and chemical composition to that of the missing vehicle. Aldrich examined the streak. His recorded assessment: paint application suggests lateral contact under pressure. Unclear how vehicle body could reach this elevation. He measured the height precisely, 73 inches from the base, far too high for anything to have brushed the rock while passing along the ground below. One volunteer suggested that the paint fragment might have been transferred secondhand, carried on clothing or equipment. Aldrich dismissed this politely, noting the absence of brush marks and the uniformity of the streak. It was applied directly, he said. As the group prepared to leave the area, one of the volunteers, Alan Breck, reported hearing what he described as a distant door shutting. His testimony was clear: a hollow thud, metallic, direction uncertain. No one else heard it, and the sound left no trace. The day ended without further discovery, yet the corridor itself posed a new problem. Examination of forestry surveys from the 1970s and 80s revealed no mention of such a path. Even erosion patterns along the slope suggested the corridor should not exist. The ground angles were inconsistent, the drainage unnatural. Alder returned to the cedar stand at dusk, gazing down the path in silence. He later wrote in his personal log, "Roads appearing, roads vanishing, fragments of a journey without continuity. If the mountain conceals a route, it does so with intention. That log would become one of the most cited documents in later academic re-examinations of the case, each reference noting that the same peculiar terrain effects had been observed in historical accounts of the Storm King region, long before the tragedy of 1991. By October 24th, the search had entered a phase that investigators would later describe as chasing the void. Evidence appeared in discrete, isolated pockets, never leading anywhere, never aligning into a coherent route. Holding the families together required constant reassurance, though Marshal Alder had less and less to offer them. That morning, Aldrich requested a revisit to the ravine, not to search for new objects, but to measure acoustic behavior. He believed the peculiar echoes reported by volunteers might be tied to geological formations known to distort sound, phenomena occasionally documented in mountainous regions like those near Storm King Mountain. With 2 surveyors assisting, he conducted a series of controlled calls, whistles, and strikes against stone. The recordings were baffling. In several instances, sounds bounced back too quickly for the measured distance, as if the ravine walls folded closer than visible. Other times, the echoes stretched unnaturally long, carrying a faint distortion. One recording captured something stranger still, a delayed return of a single syllable spoken by Aldrich, which came back faintly altered. Road became road, the vowel rounded unnaturally. Equipment analysis later suggested no mechanical malfunction. This detail never entered the official case file but survived in an appendix to Aldrich's private research notes. While the acoustic tests were underway, Alder dispatched a team to re-examine the slope west of the plateau, the area where a solitary tire-like rut had been found days earlier. This time, searchers used deeper soil probes. At roughly 8 inches, one probe struck something metallic. After widening the dig, they uncovered a small rectangular bracket, heavily scratched but free from corrosion. The district's bus maintenance supervisor identified it tentatively as a mounting bracket from a bus's undercarriage, though the style was slightly older than the 1979 model used by Harrow Ridge. The contradiction deepened. Why would an older part be found in soil with no sign of age layering? And why would it appear alone, without surrounding fragments? Nearby, something else caught Hale's attention, a narrow strip of disturbed soil forming a faint curve. Kneeling beside it, she brushed leaves aside to reveal an indentation resembling the rounded edge of a tire impression. But the soil consistency made it impossible, too soft, too loose to retain shape beneath heavy weight. And yet the curve held, crisp and unmistakable. Aldrich arrived minutes later and studied the indentation with troubled concentration. His only recorded remark, an imprint without weight, a path without presence. Shortly after noon, a call echoed across the slope. A volunteer had found another object wedged beneath the root of a fallen pine. It was the bus's route clipboard, the metal type used by drivers to keep logs secured. The clasp was bent, the surface scraped. Inside, the top sheet bore a hurried scrawl in Rourke's handwriting, continuing forward, road changed. The phrase was underlined twice. Below it, a second line, children calm, visibility low. The sheets beneath were blank. This discovery rattled even the most stalwart searchers. Rourke was known for precision. He would never abandon protocol unless pressed. Yet the note suggested confidence, however misplaced, that he believed he was on a road. That fact alone disturbed Aldrich so deeply that he took several minutes to collect himself before speaking. Alder logged the clipboard as the strongest indicator, yet that Rourke may have been misled by the terrain. But privately, he noted something else. The metal had a peculiar residue along one edge, a thin film that shimmered faintly under direct light. Laboratory analysis would later list the substance as unidentified particulate matter, non-biological. though no sample large enough for full identification was ever recovered. At sunset, the search paused as darkness spread across the slope. A fog bank hovered far off near Storm King Mountain, glowing faintly in the last red of daylight, like an illuminated veil drawn across the ridge. Several volunteers later remarked they felt watched, though no movement stirred the trees. The clipboard had shifted the tone of the investigation from bewilderment to something closer to dread. If Rourke had believed the road had changed, then the search teams were no longer dealing with a simple misjudgment. They were dealing with a man navigating a landscape that did not behave the way landscapes should. On October 25th, the county approved a final expansion of the ground search, focusing on the ridge beyond the cedar stand. The area was steep and fractured, crossed by thin runnels of old erosion. It took hours to ascend, forcing the teams into slow, deliberate steps. The journals of several volunteers described the climb as disorienting, with multiple references to feeling tilted or off balance. Aldrich suggested this might be due to uneven strata causing subtle visual distortions, a known, if uncommon, characteristic of the region near Storm King Mountain. Near midday, the first discovery of note appeared, a swatch of cloth snagged on a broken branch. It was part of a driver's windbreaker, the exact brand Rourke had been wearing. The fabric was torn along a clean diagonal line as though sliced rather than caught. The tear edges were strangely smooth, too smooth for stone or bark. Hale compared it to the cut made by a heated surface, though no scorch marks were present. A few yards farther up, the team encountered something more unsettling. A shallow trench approximately 6 feet long carved neatly into the soil. Its edges were straight, its depth uniform. It resembled an excavation, yet the surrounding dirt showed no signs of displacement. There was no pile of removed earth, no loosened debris, nothing to indicate the trench had ever been dug by hand or tool. Marshal Alder examined it closely. His entry in the case notes reads, "Trench appears pre-existing, yet inconsistent with erosion. No natural explanation presently viable." His private notebook, recovered years later, added a quieter line, "Shape reminiscent of a resting form or a temporary holding." As the team moved on, they encountered a new environmental anomaly, a subtle hum vibrating through the soles of their boots. The sensation persisted for nearly a minute before fading. Aldrich crouched to feel the earth directly but detected no heat, no pressure, no shifting. He speculated faintly about resonant frequencies from distant activity, perhaps aircraft, but the idea dissolved under scrutiny. No aircraft had flown overhead all day, and the vibration had come from below. Later that afternoon, near the ridge crest, searchers found a large patch of flattened vegetation. Unlike the impression found earlier near the ravine, this one bore a clear shape, an oblong oval roughly the size of the bus's undercarriage. The stems of the grass were bent but not broken, as if pressed gently by a massive but weightless object. Aldrich refused to theorize aloud, but his notes contain an uncharacteristically stark question: mass without force. As the wind picked up, a faint metallic tone echoed through the pines, short, sharp, almost like the resonant ring of a struck panel. It repeated once, then stopped. Dusk approached quickly at this altitude. The searchers paused at the ridge's highest accessible point, where the tree line broke briefly into open stone. From this vantage, the forest unfurled below like a dark puzzle, every pathway and clearing threaded with shadows. The volunteers fell silent as they surveyed the terrain, everywhere they had searched, and everywhere they still could not reach. Hale whispered something that was later written into her statement: "There's no place left for a bus to hide." But even that wasn't entirely true, because beyond the ridge in the fading light, they observed a thin vertical gap between two enormous slabs of stone, a crevice no wider than a doorway, empty and dark. In the moment it seemed unremarkable, a natural fissure, a geological accident. Only later, upon reviewing old forestry maps, did Alder realize that the crevice had never been documented before, not in any survey, not in any geological report, not in any of the mountain studies dating back to the early accounts near Storm King. A gap that size does not simply appear, and yet there it was. The crevice between the two stone slabs was examined the next morning, October 26th. It had rained lightly during the night, and the moisture lent the rock a dark sheen, making the fissure appear even deeper than it had the day before. Despite its narrow width, barely wide enough for a single adult to slip through, it extended downward at a slight angle, disappearing into shadow. Alder ordered a cautious approach. Two searchers equipped with helmets and lamps volunteered to explore the entrance. Hale documented the fissure's dimensions while Aldrich studied the surrounding formation. The professor's initial assessment was straightforward. The rock type and fracture patterns were typical for the region, but the placement of the gap troubled him. In his words, "The orientation suggests this fissure should have formed hundreds of years ago, not recently. Its edges are too clean, sharp almost." When the searchers stepped inside, their voices echoed back with a strange softness, as if the space swallowed part of the sound. Hale's notes remarked that the acoustics were similar to the ravine, but inverted, meaning the echoes felt compressed rather than extended. The initial descent revealed a narrow corridor of stone, slanting downward for about 20 feet before widening into a low chamber, natural, irregular, but oddly symmetrical in shape. The chamber's floor was coated in a thin layer of silt that had settled evenly, suggesting undisturbed conditions, except for one detail. At the center of the chamber lay a scattering of small items: a pencil, a shoelace, two loose crayons, and a metal button from a child's jacket. None bore signs of weathering. None had soil packed into creases. They lay as though placed gently on the ground. One of the crayons, blue, had a faint smear of yellow paint along its wrapper. The chamber walls, when illuminated, revealed long, shallow scrapes, vertical marks, parallel, spaced like the edges of something large being guided or pulled through. But the chamber was far too small for a vehicle of any kind. These contradictory elements weighed heavily on the team, who exited the space with more questions than answers. Outside, the rain clouds had lifted enough to reveal a faint outline of Storm King Mountain to the east. Aldrich stared in that direction for several minutes before writing a line in his pocket journal that would later be quoted in academic summaries of the case. This region has a history of misleading trajectories: optical, structural, acoustic. Perhaps Rourke followed a road he believed existed, shaped by perception we do not yet understand. Evidence from the chamber was bagged and logged. The shoelace belonged to one of the students, 10-year-old Neil Havers, identified by a marker stripe his mother had painted weeks earlier. The metal button belonged to a jacket not worn on the day of the field trip, suggesting it had been carried in a pocket or fallen from a child's possessions. As the investigation returned to the surface, something else occurred, an event recorded by 3 searchers independently. A low, rhythmic vibration trembled through the stone beneath their feet. It pulsed 5 times, paused, then pulsed twice more. No aircraft were overhead. No heavy machinery was anywhere near the ridge. The vibration lasted perhaps 8 seconds and then ceased. Aldrich dismissed it aloud as thermal stress in the rock, but his private notes contradict that reassurance. In them he wrote, "Not thermal, patterned." By late afternoon, the fissure was sealed off for safety. Alder made the difficult decision to suspend deeper exploration until structural engineers could evaluate the risk. The day ended with a somber walk back toward camp, down the ridge, through the narrowing trees, past the corridor that had appeared only days before. The forest felt quieter than ever, as though something had withdrawn just beyond the threshold of sight. And for the first time since the search began, several volunteers reported the same sensation simultaneously. That they were being followed, not by footsteps, not by sound, but by the shifting of silence itself. By October 27th, the atmosphere around the investigation had changed. What had begun as a missing persons effort now felt, to those who remained, like the study of an environment behaving outside familiar rules. The county, preparing to transition into a limited search posture, requested one final sweep of the lower slopes leading back toward Harrow Ridge. Alder agreed, though his private notes suggest he doubted anything new would emerge there. The early morning was unusually warm for late October, and sunlight filtered weakly through a thin haze. 3 search teams fanned out across the forest floor, moving slowly, marking every shift in the ground. The area they covered included paths that had been walked repeatedly in the first days of the search, terrain believed to be thoroughly examined. Yet within the first hour, the Western group radioed in. They had found something. It was a section of bus paneling, roughly the size of a notebook, painted in the same yellow shade as number 6. The metal was smooth, unbent, and bore no dirt or weathering. But what unsettled the team was its placement. It lay gently atop a bed of pine needles, needles which, judging by their brittle dryness, had fallen at least a week prior. If the panel had been there the whole time, it should have been buried beneath the debris. If it had not been there, then it had appeared recently in an area walked by dozens of people. Aldrich examined it closely. The sheared edge was clean, almost too clean, and lacked the rasp of torn metal. He murmured something about precision separation, but formalized nothing in his log. Minutes later, the central team reported another discovery, a faint sequence of partial shoe impressions, small, inconsistent, scattered in a zigzag pattern. They appeared to belong to a child, but the depth was uneven, as though the weight had been only partially applied. The impressions terminated abruptly at a section of untouched soil. No continuation, no scuffing, no distortion of the leaf litter. Hale measured the spacing and noted that the stride length did not match any of the missing students based on their school records. The footprints were too short for the older children, too long for the youngest. Intermediate or inconsistent was her conclusion, a phrase that would frustrate analysts for years. Meanwhile, the Eastern group made a discovery that forced the search to halt completely. At the base of a slanted boulder, one that had been passed dozens of times, a scrap of paper fluttered in a faint breeze. It was a torn corner of lined notebook paper, folded once. Inside were 3 words, written in pencil. "Still on road." The handwriting was nearly identical to that found on the clipboard 2 days earlier. The pencil pressure was light, shaky, and the graphite was smudged as though the writer had been interrupted. Alder ordered the area cordoned off and the paper bagged immediately. But when he returned to the boulder later that afternoon with 2 additional officers, he noticed something that had not been there before. On the stone surface, faint but unmistakable, was a streak of yellow paint, fresh enough that it glistened in the light. The streak sat at a height roughly consistent with the lower half of the bus's body, but the boulder showed no signs of recent disturbance. No chips, no scrape marks, no loosened debris. The paint simply existed there without any evidence of how it had been transferred. One of the volunteers, a school janitor named Frank Eldon, whispered the question many had already thought. "Is it passing through here when we're not?" Alder said nothing in response, but in his private notebook, he wrote a line that reveals his true reaction. "Something moves when unobserved, pattern unclear, not random." That entry would be cited years later by researchers reviewing the strange terrain behaviors near Storm King Mountain. behaviors described in forestry accounts long before 1991 as roots that shift when eyes are turned. The discovery of fresh paint on the boulder altered the tone of the investigation yet again. By October 28th, many volunteers had withdrawn, citing exhaustion or family obligations, leaving only a core group of searchers and the county officials. Alder convened a quiet meeting at dawn and informed the remaining team that active searching would soon wind down. But before that happened, he wanted one final, comprehensive push along the midslopes, an area where terrain, evidence, and anomalies seemed to intersect. The midslopes were dense with fallen trunks and uneven rock, the kind of terrain where movement was slow and observation required constant recalibration. As the group fanned out, Hale took to mapping micro-features of the forest floor with almost obsessive precision. Her sketches, later archived, show careful cross-hatching of soil textures, branch angles, and drainage lines. She believed that subtle shifts in the land might reveal a pattern the team had yet to see. It was Hale who made the next discovery. Near a stand of lodgepole pines, she found a shallow indentation, rectangular about the size of a bus step panel. The soil within showed a fine, even compression. She pressed into it gently with her fingertips. The indentation held its shape. But the surrounding earth was soft enough that any weight should have left deeper, sharper edges. Inside the depression lay an object, a metal hinge no larger than a palm, with a faint yellow residue along its spine. It matched the type used on the emergency exits of older bus models. But the metal was strangely clean, as though it had not weathered outside at all. Aldrich studied it, shook his head, and muttered, again without oxidation, "Impossible unless it hasn't been here long." Less than 30 yards downslope, the group encountered a second anomaly, a pair of parallel lines carved into the soil. Each line was straight, shallow, and extended for nearly 6 feet. They resembled track impressions but were spaced too narrowly for a bus, too widely for ordinary tools, and too perfect for erosion. Hale traced them with her measuring tape, her hands trembling slightly. "These are deliberate," she whispered. "But deliberate by what?" At that moment, a low groan echoed across the slope. It wasn't like the earlier metallic taps or distant thuds. This sound was longer, resonant, as if the forest itself had shifted its weight. Several searchers dropped into a crouch instinctively. Alder raised his hand, motioning for silence. The groan faded as slowly as it had risen. Aldrich examined the nearest trees and found nothing amiss. No fresh splits, no movement of earth. And yet the sound had been strong enough to reverberate through the ground. A moment later, Hale pointed to a cluster of stones slightly uphill. They had slumped inward, forming a shape almost like an arc, newly shifted, despite no sign of disturbance around them. The team continued cautiously until they reached a clearing they had crossed multiple times in previous days. But something was different. A tree, an old, twisted fir, now leaned at a sharper angle than before. Not enough to suggest imminent fall, but enough to be noticeable to anyone with a careful eye. Hale checked her sketches from 2 days earlier. The tree had stood straighter then, much straighter. Aldrich ran his hand along the exposed roots and found fine dust sifting upward between them, as if the ground beneath had recently settled, not from rain or traffic, but from displacement. What kind of displacement, he could not say. Further into the clearing, another object awaited them, the torn cover of a student workbook, half buried in the soil. The edges were frayed, damp. The name on the inside cover, written in childish block letters, was that of Carter Lind, the boy whose mitten had been found days earlier in the ravine. But what froze the team was the state of the soil around it. The earth had compacted into a slight concavity, perfectly smooth, with no footprints leading toward or away. It was as though the workbook had settled from above downward rather than arriving horizontally. Alder stared for a long time before finally saying, We mark this, we log this, and then we step back. In his private notebook that night, he wrote a single line: terrain behaving as if under instruction. That phrase would later appear in speculative academic discussions of anomalous landforms near Storm King Mountain, always cautiously, always accompanied by caveats, but never entirely dismissed. October 29th marked what would become the final full day of coordinated searching. The county's resources were thinning, the volunteers were exhausted, and the families, though hopeful, were beginning to fray under the strain. Alder planned one last targeted sweep focused on a broad crescent-shaped shelf north of the earlier ridge. It was one of the few remaining areas that had not yielded evidence, yet lay directly between multiple anomalous finds. Weather that morning was strangely calm. No wind, no bird movement. Even the forest's usual rustling seemed muted. Hale later likened it to a held breath. The shelf was accessible only by a narrow climb along a tilted seam of granite. The first team reached the top around 9 a.m., securing ropes for the rest. The ground there was unusually even, a flat run of compacted soil broken only by scattered roots. Aldrich remarked that the area looked undisturbed for decades, but that assessment changed quickly. Near the center of the shelf lay a small circle of objects placed, not dropped: a child's hair clip, the rubber handle of a lunchbox, a binder ring from a 3-hole notebook, a pencil shaved down nearly to its eraser, all positioned equidistantly as though arranged with care. Hale photographed them before touching anything. Alder knelt beside the pencil. Its tip was snapped, but not from pressure on the ground. The break was crisp, angled, consistent with being bent by fingers. The wood inside was clean and pale, free of dirt, as though it had broken very recently. As the team debated how the items had arrived there, another searcher called out from the northern edge of the shelf. He had found a broad swath of disturbed needles, subtle but patterned, forming a crescent parallel to the shelf's shape. Within the arc, the ground was smoother than the surrounding soil, almost polished. Aldrich speculated that wind might cause such smoothing, but the symmetry argued otherwise, and the air remained still. Then came the most jarring discovery. Embedded lightly in the smoothed earth was a single tire impression, partial, faint, but unmistakably from a vehicle matching the dimensions of bus number 6. It was incomplete, ending abruptly as though the vehicle had pressed down only momentarily before lifting away. No surrounding impressions existed, no weight distribution, no second tire, just one curved fragment as if the rest of the bus had never touched the ground. Alder, visibly shaken, insisted on verifying the measurement twice. Hale confirmed it. Aldrich wrote quietly in his notebook, "Localized contact without traverse, cannot reconcile." Moments later, something happened that would become one of the most debated events in the case. A low rolling tremor, softer than thunder but deeper than any machinery, resonated across the shelf, coming not from the sky but from the forest below. It rose in volume for several seconds, then cut abruptly. Concurrently, a faint yellow shimmer passed across a patch of air near the shelf's edge, so subtle that only 3 searchers saw it, describing it later as sunlight bending, or heat rising from nothing. Alder ordered everyone back. The tremor had unsettled the group, and the shimmer, even if a trick of light, had pushed nerves to the breaking point. But just before retreating, Hale spotted something else. Faint yellow flecks caught in the bark of a nearby tree. She scraped one with her fingernail. It was paint, dry, new, identical to the earlier samples, and again at a height that made no sense. Too low for a bus body, too high for debris carried by hand. The team withdrew down the rope line in silence. That evening, while documenting the day's finds, Alder wrote a final private note. "Evidence appears in places we just searched, as if placed, as if tracking us, Cannot tell if we are following it or it is following us. A line that would echo in later decades whenever the case was revisited, each time returning to the same unsettling question of what exactly had been moving through those woods near Storm King Mountain. By October 30th, the search had reached its final, thinnest edge. The county prepared to formally scale down operations, and only a small, hollow-eyed group remained in the field. No one said it aloud, but every person understood. Whatever had happened to bus number 6 lay beyond the limits of ordinary search methodology. Still, Alder requested one last examination of the lower ridge, a region that had yielded inconsistencies but no decisive sign. The day began gray and cool, the sun struggling to break through a pale veil of cloud. Storm King Mountain loomed faintly to the east, its outline softened by distance, a quiet reminder of how many strange testimonies and terrains in the region's history had echoed the oddities encountered in this case. The searchers advanced methodically, revisiting old checkpoints. What they found first was subtle. Several branches that had been upright days earlier now bent inward across the trail, tips touching the ground. The bend was uniform but showed no splintering, as though the wood had softened before returning to rigidity. Hale checked her sketches and circled the discrepancy silently. Farther along, a patch of soil, one they had walked across repeatedly, had changed. The surface now bore a faint depression, oval-shaped, shallow. It resembled the earlier weightless impressions, but smaller, more focused, as if something had rested briefly and then lifted without dispersing pressure. Aldrich brushed the surface lightly. The soil's texture was compact, dry, unchanged by weather that could have explained a new formation. Then near a stand of aspens, the team encountered something unmistakable. A long smear of yellow paint streaked across a stone, far fresher than anything found before, unfaded, sharp-edged. But it was angled downward, as though applied by an object moving vertically rather than horizontally. Hale knelt to measure it. The smear began nearly 6 feet above ground and ended just over 2 feet from the base. A bus, descending vertically, made no sense, and yet the streak existed. Alder touched the stone and found the paint tacky, still drying. The searchers froze. While they attempted to reconcile the impossible timeline, a call rang out from deeper in the trees. One of the younger volunteers, Jacob Fenton, had found an object wedged into the crook of an aspen's exposed roots. It was a metal wristwatch. The watch belonged to Dennis Rourke. His wife later confirmed it, scratches along the band, a missing segment of the clasp. But more disturbing was the time displayed. 4:12 p.m., the exact minute the school had made its first call to the marshal's office the day the bus failed to return. The watch still ticked. Aldrich checked it twice, even held it to his ear. It kept perfect rhythm as though untouched by a week in the wilderness. Hale whispered what everyone was already thinking. This shouldn't be running. But the most unsettling detail was yet to be noticed. The watch's underside, the panel against the wrist, was coated in a thin dusting of the same shimmering particulate found earlier on the clipboard recovered near the ravine. The particles glinted faintly in the light, vanishing when the watch was tilted, like motes collapsing into shadow. No one touched the dust directly. As the team stood in stunned silence, a faint vibration tremored through the ground. Short bursts, irregular, nothing like the patterned pulses reported earlier. This one felt more organic, as though the land sighed beneath their feet. Alder, pale and exhausted, finally made the call to end the day's search. Darkness was coming early through the clouds, and the air felt heavy with something unspoken. His final log entry of the night read, "More evidence after we pass, appearing behind, as though the path is rewriting itself, or we are crossing something's wake." It would be the last entry he wrote before the county officially suspended the search the following morning. October 31st, 1991, the final official day of the search, began with a somber quiet that felt heavier than any weather system. Word had spread through Harrow Ridge that operations were ending, and families gathered near the school in small circles, speaking in muted tones, watching the hills as though an answer might emerge from the tree line at any moment. The Corps search team returned to the field one last time, not to expand the perimeter but to revisit the central anomalies: the cedar stand, the corridor that had appeared overnight, the plateau with impossible impressions. They moved slowly, pausing often, as though listening for something the mountain might be waiting to reveal. The cedar stand was unchanged. The air still hung colder there, the bark still carried faint, inexplicable scratches, and the soil still bore those shallow depressions, too deliberate in shape, too inconsistent with any known movement of man or machine. Hale pressed her boot gently beside one indentation. The soil dipped under her weight, but the depression remained undisturbed, as if it belonged to another layer of time. The corridor leading downslope had altered again. This time it appeared narrower, its edges less defined, as though folding back into the forest. The clearing where Jennifer Love's collapsed backpack had been found was now carpeted in fresh needles, despite there being no wind the previous night. The indentation where the bag had rested, the soft, concave hollow, was still visible beneath the new layer, refusing to be erased. Alder's face grew drawn as he observed this. In his final official report, he described the phenomenon simply as environmental reset inconsistent with natural rates of deposition. His private notebook added a sharper line: tracks closing when unseen. At the plateau, nothing new appeared, no fresh impressions, no new fragments. And yet something felt different. The air was unnervingly still, soundless to a degree that unsettled even the most skeptical among them. Aldrich tapped a stone with the end of his survey rod. The echo came back wrong, again compressed, distorted, closer than the open space allowed. On the northern edge of the plateau, Hale found a thin yellow fleck on a pine needle paint, but smaller than any previous sample. She lifted it carefully. It crumbled into dust between her gloved fingers. "Too fresh to be brittle," she whispered. As they descended the ridge for the final time, another tremor rippled beneath the soil, brief, delicate, but patterned, as though responding to their steps. One of the volunteers swore he heard a distant metallic rattle, like a loose panel swaying gently in motion. No one else heard it, but no one questioned him. Back at the command post, Alder gave the announcement the families had been dreading. The active phase of the search was ending. Investigators would continue analyzing evidence, and forestry teams would monitor the area, but the on-foot search was suspended. Parents wept, stared, refused to leave the lot. Some clung to the possibility that the children were still alive somewhere beyond the mapped world. Others feared the opposite, that the bus had gone somewhere unreachable, not by distance, but by the nature of whatever had drawn it off course. That evening, as the final equipment was packed, Hale walked alone to the edge of the schoolyard, facing the distant silhouette of Storm King Mountain. She later wrote in her personal account, never published but archived decades later, "I do not believe the bus is lost. I believe it followed something, a path we cannot see but one that exists for those who trust it. Rourke believed he was still on the road. The children believed him. Somehow the land believed it too." Meanwhile, in the marshal's empty office, Alder closed his notebook for the last time. His final line, the last written word connected directly to the active investigation, read, "Tracks end everywhere and begin nowhere. Something moved through this forest, and whatever it was, it left only what it wished us to find." The search was over, but the mountain was not finished. In the weeks that followed the suspension of the search, Harrow Ridge entered a quiet, haunted rhythm. School resumed with half-filled classrooms and subdued hallways. Parents lingered longer at doors. Teachers paused more often at the windows, glancing toward the tree line as though expecting a yellow shape to drift back into view. County investigators continued their analyses, but every piece of evidence seemed to unravel under scrutiny. Soil samples contradicted one another. Paint flecks deteriorated too quickly or not at all. The vibrating ground patterns, captured faintly on seismograph equipment brought in during the final days, showed no correlation with known geological activity. Aldrich returned to his university, where he spent the winter compiling his notes into a private manuscript. In it, he referenced Storm King Mountain several times, drawing connections to earlier testimonies from forestry workers who described the region as topographically deceptive. He noted similarities between those accounts and the shifting impressions, odd acoustics, and rearranged terrain seen during the search for bus number 6. Though he never published the manuscript, small excerpts circulated among colleagues, quietly, cautiously, fueling academic curiosity tinged with unease. Marshall Alder, meanwhile, grew increasingly withdrawn. Those who knew him said he walked the edges of town most evenings, carrying no flashlight, stopping frequently to listen. One neighbor recalled watching him stand motionless beside the old fence line, head tilted slightly, as if waiting for a sound he could no longer dismiss as wind. His notebooks, later archived, contained sporadic entries from that period, most no longer than a single sentence. The forest remembers. Paths shift when unobserved. Nothing ends cleanly up there. Harrow Ridge folklore absorbed the tragedy quickly, almost instinctively. Children whispered about the road that isn't there. Older residents revived older stories, half-forgotten mentions of travelers in the 1950s losing their sense of direction near the slopes, hunters in the 1930s hearing wagon wheels where none existed, and a rancher in 1912 claiming to follow a familiar trail that folded back on itself. None of the stories offered answers. They offered only echoes. A year later, hikers passing through the region reported a peculiar sight along the mid-slope, a faint, rounded depression in the soil, exactly the width of a large vehicle tire. It appeared alone, with no pattern leading toward it or away. When investigators revisited the site 2 weeks later, the depression was gone, smoothed perfectly, as if brushed away by a patient hand. Other accounts surfaced gradually. A pair of teenagers camping near the lower ridge claimed they heard children laughing faintly after midnight. A local hunter reported seeing a rectangular glimmer of yellow through the trees, gone the moment he turned toward it. A trail runner swore he heard the deep, hollow rattle of an engine in the far distance, though the forest around him was still. No evidence ever substantiated these claims, but none were disproven either. Storm King Mountain remained as it always had, quiet, imposing, indifferent. And yet, for those who knew the story, the mountain took on a different character, not malevolent, not supernatural, but inscrutable. A landscape that played by rules older than maps, older than roads, older perhaps than the understanding humans laid upon it. Today, long after the official case went cold, hikers still talk about strange sensations along the slopes, moments of disorientation, paths that seem to bend subtly, echoes that return in unfamiliar tones. Some chalk it up to altitude, others to imagination. But a few, usually the ones who walk alone, tell of something else. A fleeting glimpse of yellow between the trees, disappearing just before the eye can focus. Not a bus. Not exactly. More like the memory of one. A hint of motion where motion shouldn't be, lingering only long enough to remind the observer that whatever happened in 1991 never truly settled into the earth. The forest holds its silence. The mountain holds its secrets. And somewhere in the shifting quiet of the Colorado slopes, The unanswered question remains, traced softly in disturbed soil, faint paint, impossible impressions. Where did the road lead that day? And why did it open only once?